Hello and welcome. I recently posted the story of the brave Australian Coastwatchers active to the north of Australia during World War II. There were far safer assignments than hiding amid tropical rainforests on Japanese occupied islands to spy on the enemy and radio information to Allied intelligence. Capture was an all too real possibility and would spell certain torture and death. But that was precisely the duty for which some 800 Australians volunteered. These were arguably the most vital yet unsung heroes of the Pacific War. Among their number was a lone American GI, the remarkable Benjamin Franklin Nash. Franklin, to family and friends, spent more than 2 years observing and reporting on Japanese activities from behind their lines. A fellow American soldier said, "I remember Frank Nash expressing a desire to get into coast watching, and I figured the guy must be stark raving mad. It was bad enough at Guadalcanal, but to consider operating a radio from Japanese territory seemed suicidal." Working in teams behind enemy lines, coast watchers reported on Japanese movements in the Pacific. It required daring men and women willing to set up observation posts on occupied islands teeming with enemy troops to observe their sea, land and air build-up and dispositions, then transmit coded intelligence in the open. Based on their information, planners would create lists of viable targets for Allied ships, fighter planes and dive bombers. If that wasn't dangerous enough work, the coast watchers also took responsibility for rescuing downed airmen and shipwrecked sailors. Nash seemed an unlikely candidate for such a group. He grew up on his family's Colorado cattle ranch. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the 23-year-old immediately left school and enlisted in the army. He shipped out to the South Pacific and was assigned as a radio operator to the 410th Signal Company, initially stationed in the New Hebrides, now present-day Vanuatu. In January 1943, the 410th moved to Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where Nash helped install and operate the first Allied radio control tower at Henderson Field, a vital and hotly contested airstrip recently wrested from the Japanese. Nash learned of the Coast Watchers, an organisation of the Royal Australian Navy volunteers who set up posts on enemy-held South Pacific islands to report on Japanese movements. These were not professional military men. The watchers appointed by the Navy, recalled Lieutenant Commander Eric Feld, wartime director of the Coast Watchers, were generally postmasters, harbour masters, school teachers, police or railway officials, people who had at hand the means of passing information by telegraph. As a radio operator, Nash was privy to accounts of their dramatic sea rescues of downed aviators and shipwrecked sailors, as well as transmissions that warned of Japanese troop movements and enabled the interception and sinking of countless enemy vessels. The Coast Watchers had infiltrated the broadleaf forests of the Solomons, working closely with friendly natives while seeking to avoid those with Japanese sympathies. To avoid detection, they kept moving from one barely accessible location to another, shouldering heavy equipment that included the radio set, generator and fuel. This was the sort of action that appealed to Nash, and he wanted in. He later told an interviewer the prospect of spying on the enemy and reporting their activities intrigued the hell out of him. But a few significant obstacles stood in his way. The Yank had no training or experience in the type of clandestine warfare practiced by the Coast Watchers. He was not a member of the Australian military. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie, Felt's deputy, happened to need a good radio operator and agreed to put the eager American to work, providing he applied for temporary reassignment from the US Army to the Royal Australian Navy. After sending the relevant paperwork and waiting for a predictably slow response, an impatient Nash chose to reassign himself. "I sort of deserted," he recalled. The transfer papers eventually arrived. Taking on Nash proved an inspired decision. As irregulars, the Coastwatchers often ran short of supplies and provisions. Their new Yank colleague was an answer to their prayers, for Nash always seemed to be able to beg, borrow, steal, or build what they required. In early May 1943, the brass at Henderson Field decided to send a man to assist RAN Sub-Lieutenant Reg Evans, a wiry and resourceful coast watcher. Evans had set up a one-man observation post high on the small volcanic island of Kolombangara. From his perch, he watched the comings and goings of enemy shipping as thousands of Japanese soldiers built an airstrip below him. His radio reports to Air Strike Command regarding enemy shipping had already cost the Japanese dearly. Mackenzie overcame his initial reluctance, and in mid-May, after Nash completed a 3-day crash course in jungle survival, natives delivered the young American to Kolombangara in a dugout canoe. Nash could not have had a better mentor in Reg Evans. The older man had an uncanny ability to adapt to his surroundings and a knack for recognising and reporting important enemy developments. A few months after Nash's arrival on the island, the teammates were involved in a rescue operation with future international ramifications. On one moonless night in August, Evans and Nash spotted a sudden eruption of flames against the inky black sky and sea. Obviously, a vessel had been hit. The next morning, the pair spotted wreckage in mid-channel but found no sailors. Nearly a week later, however, after a heroic effort in which the young lieutenant commanding the vessel managed to drag or lead ashore 10 of his 12 crewmen, Evans' native scouts reported having encountered the shipwrecked sailors on a nearby island. Evans immediately sent a half-dozen native paddlers in a supply canoe to collect them. Evans invited the young American into his tent for tea. The skipper of the wrecked PT-109 was Lieutenant John Fitzgerald Kennedy, future 35th US President. Immediately after Kennedy's rescue, Evans relocated to nearby Gurmu, leaving his American partner the sole Allied presence on Kolombangara, with several thousand Japanese to keep him company. As the Solomons campaign heated up, the Allies and Japanese engaged in a massive game of maritime chess. The Allies had initiated their island-hopping strategy of bypassing and isolating various enemy strongholds, forcing the Japanese to hurriedly evacuate troops from bases that were no longer viable. From his observation post high up on the island of Kolombangara, Nash radioed their movements to Evans, who relayed the intelligence to direct Allied strikes. When the Japanese evacuated Kolombangara, Nash moved his equipment to the Coastwatchers' advanced base on Munda. There, Nash received orders to scout Mono, one of the Treasury Islands, in preparation for an Allied landing. His patrols yielded valuable information, as well as the rescue of 3 US airmen who had been shot down that June. The wind and ocean currents had propelled their raft to Mono, where the trio had spent the intervening months. Meanwhile, hundreds of Japanese troops fleeing the Allied advance swarmed onto Mono. After assessing the situation on the ground, Nash arranged a rendezvous with a PT boat and returned to base with both accurate intelligence and the rescued airmen. The New Guinea campaign was going full tilt, and on November 1, the Allies landed a force at Torokina, a coastal village on the south side of heavily occupied Bougainville. Before any of the thousands of troops hit the beach, a half-dozen coastwatchers, including Nash, had landed to observe the enemy. Our basic job on Bougainville, Nash recalled, was to go up into the bush and keep an eye on the Japs so they wouldn't come back down while we built an airstrip at Torokina. There was a lot of enemy left on Bougainville. We had to be prepared at a moment's notice. By definition, the Coastwatchers were strictly observers and information gatherers. Combat was not part of their mandate. Eric Velt said, "It was not their duty to fight and thus draw attention to themselves. It was their duty to sit circumspectly and unobtrusively and gather information." In December 1945, Nash was honourably discharged from the army with medals from the United States, Britain and Australia. These included the US Legion of Merit, South Pacific Service Ribbon with 2 battle stars and 2 Presidential Unit Citation, as well as Britain's George Medal. He was indeed a remarkable man. Thank you for watching. Please comment to add to the conversation. Like, subscribe and hit the notify bell.